right. Well, I want to attack this topic from entrepreneurship. And I know we've had a lot about the good social problems and the bad social problems in society. But I think the theme here is entrepreneurship. So I want to steer right in from the core of entrepreneurship. And that is, you have a great idea, you've got the resources to get it done, and good timing, which I call luck. So you need those three things. And I'm not going to hold myself accountable for all the great ideas, because I think you all brought many of those. And timing is out of all of our hands at some level. But let's talk about resources for a second. Usually in entrepreneurship, as we heard, there's a sort of a greenfield mentality that you start with nothing, and then you have to, get the team together and raise money or whatever you need to do to build something up from the ground. And I'd like to challenge your thinking a little bit on that, and that there is actually a way to leverage your tax dollars to get a little bit of the way off the ground, or maybe a lot of it of the way off the ground. And to illustrate my point, I'd like to introduce you to Peter Franz Pauls. Now, Peter and a couple of college friends in 1991 went to the University of Amsterdam. They studied, technical things mostly, and they were very excited about starting a business right out of school. So in '91, they formed a company called PalmTop Software. Now, PalmTop Software was exploiting the tremendous opportunity that a palm-sized computer represented. And for those of you that are too young, this was a revolution. And so they had gone to technical college studying route planning and wayfinding and all these kinds of things. And we were on the cusp of a revolution, because before, if you wanted to look at how to get from point A to point B, you had to pull out a paper map. And you had to sort of measure, and you saw like what the index was, miles per inches, and you put a piece of string, whatever. That's how people would get around, and that's how they would do route planning. Suddenly, the power of a computer is in your actual hand. And if you know something about route planning algorithms, you could actually let somebody put in my starting point and my ending point, and magically, in your hand, it would give you the route that is shortest or fastest or whatever. Okay, so that was great. So they start PalmTop Software, and they're going around and they're calling on companies that do deliveries and over-the-road trucking, and all the people that you would imagine would care about having in your palm a whole bunch of maps. And I mean a whole bunch of maps, right? Like hundreds of thousands of maps could be in your palm instead of in the seat next to you and the truck you're driving. And so that's really exciting. Turns out it's not such a great business, to be honest with you. So they work for like 8 years, and they grow their revenue to about 2 million euros. And they're sweating it out, and the margin's kind of terrible, and they got to pay the map guys to send them map files, and it's not so great. But of course, Peter and his friends knew that above them, around the planet, was a constellation of satellites. And there's no great secret, because we started launching the satellites in the 70s, and it became sort of a thing to know about if you knew anything about maps. And so there's 24 of them. And they're 14 miles above the surface of the Earth, and 6 of them are in view from any point on the Earth at any time. And it's a great thing if you're into getting around, right? It's good to have a system that can do that. Unfortunately, that was a system that was only for the benefit of the Department of Defense. And the Department of Defense paid for it. It was somewhere between $50 and $100 billion. It's hard to actually get the facts and figures, but let's just say it was a whole lot of money, and it came out of your taxes. Now, President Clinton, early in his administration, pushed to get part of that signal available to the public. And so they called it selective availability. And really, it's not a very good thing. It says, I'll give you GPS, but it'll be good sort of plus or minus 100 meters, which is outstanding if you're driving a tanker and you need to find a port. I mean, it's fantastic. It's exactly what you need. If you're in a city and you're trying to drive around, you get to find out about the turn you missed 5 seconds after you pass it, right? And so, not so good. But Peter and his friends worked pretty hard, and they plugged in these external devices, and they tried to make a go of it, and it was still tough going. Then President Clinton signs an executive order and says, the heck with it, let's just make it all available all the time. Full resolution. Friends and foes alike get full GPS coverage. Well, that was a pretty good thing. So in PalmTop Software's business, having that kind of accuracy expanded the market dramatically. And so that little piece of something that wasn't in their business plan, right? They couldn't afford one of the $400 million satellites that's involved here without going belly up immediately, right? So they go from a couple $1 million in revenue to say, or euros, 39 million euros annually. Well, that's pretty exciting. And so then they said, well, gosh, maybe these Palm computers, maybe people would just want navigation devices. And so in 2004, with tremendous growth in revenue, they decided to create their own GPS devices. And they said, you know, Palm Top is such a sleepy, terrible name. Let's rename the company TomTom, because that's fun. And so they rename it TomTom, and they start producing GPS receivers. And the rest is history. And it's a good history for all of them. So, you know, by 2005, they're at, you know, 700 million euros, about $1 billion in revenue. Our friend Peter was smiling on the first slide because he was declared the richest Dutch person alive in 2006 under the age of 40. Now, I don't know what that means to you, but I think that's still pretty exciting. And so one of his co-founders, with his extra proceeds in 2006, set up a foundation with 100 million euros to work on leprosy. So the lesson here is that public infrastructure, which I think is not a new idea that a commercial entity would attempt to leverage a public asset, because we've been building roads and rails and runways for a long time, and those have been to the benefit of entrepreneurs for a very long time. And in an economy that was exclusively about making stuff and moving stuff, that's great. But the economy has moved to include an information component. And in an information economy, I think we have to think differently about what infrastructure is. And so perhaps there's a public information infrastructure that will enable a whole generation of entrepreneurs. I'll just give you a quick version of how I stumbled into all of this. So I came from the media business, you know, websites where you read about stuff, technology stuff originally. And then I said, well, you know, I want to start my own company. I had some good friends, some of them are in the room, who helped me get off the ground as a startup. And I was in the healthcare business, and we're not going to be depressed by earlier comments. I was in the third that was about, you know, working on those chronic diseases. And so I discovered quickly as an entrepreneur that my single biggest cost was the cost of content. So in healthcare, you just can't make stuff up, really, you know, because people read it and then they might do it. And so it's better if it's actually right. And so to get it right, you need to pay people that have a lot of student loan debt, and, you know, they charge a lot. So it's a terrible thing. And so when you look around, you say, well, who am I competing with? And I look at WebMD and I look at Yahoo Health. It turns out they had troves and troves of content about these diseases and treatments. And when you look a little deeper, you saw that they stole it from the federal government. Well, not really stole it. It was available. They found it, and then they repackaged it, and it was free because it was already paid for by your taxes. And so I was pretty excited about it. And so I actually became, for a period of my life, an activist, but actually sort of more of a whacktivist, because I was kind of obsessed with the issue. And so I found a watchdog organization called Open the Government, and they're an angry group of people that run around with a big key, and they say, we want the government to be open. And it was good timing because President Obama signed a directive in 2009 compelling all of his agencies to produce plans for how they were going to make more data and information available to the American public. And so I showed up at the right place at the right time. That's that timing piece. And so I went to this watchdog organization, and they said, who wants to audit the Health and Human Services Open Government Plan? I raised my hand, the very highest, pick me, pick me. They pick me, and I blow a toner cartridge of my printer, printing out their Open Government Plan, and I go through it all, and I'm really paranoid. And so I'm convinced that there are terabytes, brontobytes of information that the federal government has that really just needs to be unleashed, and that they're hiding it all in this terrible PDF document. And so I'm going through it, redlining it, right? And so I give the plan a C-. Now, the interesting thing about this watchdog group is that the Washington Post dialed into what these guys do. And so 2 days after I turn in the C- for Health and Human Services, and it's published in the Washington Post that puts them sort of in the bottom of the pack, I get a call, kind of an emergency panic call, from the Chief Technology Officer of the Department of Health and Human Services, Todd Park. Todd said, Ted, I don't really know who you are, but I'd love to meet you. And I'm wondering what you're doing tomorrow at 7 a.m. And that was kind of fun. So I'm like, well, Todd, 7 a.m., sure. So I happened to be in DC, And so I went, foot of Capitol Hill where this Death Star HHS building is, and I go meet with Todd, and believe it or not, I wasn't his first meeting for the day. So that tells you something. And so sitting across the table from Todd, I'm like, well, I guess I'm a rigorous grader. He said, yeah, you're a rigorous grader. So for those of you who don't know Todd, he's a Harvard-trained economist who started one of the first electronic medical records companies, Athena Health, and which IPO'd. And so he's independently wealthy, and he's a public servant. He's doing this because he was asked to do it. And so I think I was a little outgunned sort of immediately. And so we had this nice little discussion about what gets in the way of unleashing this kind of infrastructure onto entrepreneurs. And so not 4 months after that C-, I'm interviewing for a job at HHS, and Todd is on the other side of the table, and he smiles, and he says, Ted, it'd be good for you to come over here. Why don't you work on this side of the table for a little while? And so a year after I issue the C-, I'm organizing his Health Data Initiative conference, which is a showcase for entrepreneurs and investors and policymakers to come together and look at what's possible with newly liberated, in Todd's language, data liberation, the liberated data from HHS. And it was fantastic. And so, you took hospital data and you could throw it up on a map and you could color code it to scare people. But, essentially at the end of the day, it really does matter in some cities whether the ambulance turns left or right on the way to the hospital, what kind of outcome you may have. And so that's good to know. He had a little 3-person shop out of Madison, Wisconsin, that had taken all the clinical trials data, ingested it, added social media data to it, to essentially try to figure out what happens when people are taking not maybe 2 drugs that might interact with each other, but 3 or 4 or 5, which is pretty common if you're over the age of 60. And so they were able to create this mashup of robust federal FDA data, mashing it up with the real world experiences of people living with these diseases and treating these diseases. So that's exciting. It happens to be the best ranked organic search result for most drug interactions. 3 people, mostly powered by government data. Data that they couldn't afford to go make, right? The $400 million satellite for them is all of that information about all of those drugs. Tim O'Reilly, who coined the term Web 2.0, and is widely regarded as the Thomas Jefferson of the internet, glommed onto this very quickly and sort of declared, government is a platform for lean startups, tech startups, that we really should be building off of this tremendous asset that we have. And it's a pretty good pitch. And so in about July, I get a call from another entrepreneur, civic leader, our Mayor Greg Fischer, and says, why don't you stop doing all that highfalutin stuff in Washington and come down where the people live? His term was get a little closer to the customer. And there's a lot of truth to that we all have to live somewhere, right? Some XY coordinate is where you live. And that's really the heart of human experience. And so working at the local level brings some new and different challenges to what otherwise would be a very sort of esoteric discussion. And so I got here and we just started working on getting the TARC buses into Google Maps. And I know that doesn't look like heroic work, but it's symbolic and important work, because you don't want to be the city that has the grayed out bus. So you can get there by walking, by car, by bike, or keep pounding on the gray bus and you can't get there by bus. Solve that problem. But let me tell you that the most important thing about solving that problem is then it puts that data up into an environment where others can work with it. So we held a transportation camp and all sorts of interesting things happened. We had an IT guy from the School for the Blind that took the data down and put it into an app that vibrates for folks who are blind so they know where the bus stop is. And so I think that's pretty powerful, and I think that's what we want to do, right? We want to unleash that public data for who knows what purposes. Another good one is bridge inspection data. So this is a community that's gotten very excited about bridges. And so you're not surprised that if we actually just sort of knew about not just the ones that go across rivers, which is very exciting, but the ones that you actually go across on your way perhaps to work if you don't live across a river. Some of them are red and you might want to know about them. I'm just saying. So then we shift gears, we talk about like the health of where we live. And health is a local issue, for sure. And so we have an entrepreneur in our community now working with a device that helps those with breathing disorders know how often they're having attacks, know where they are in case there's a place that's aggravating them. We have some air quality issues in Louisville, so not unhealthy for all individuals is what that says. So just there's nobody's excluded, so nobody should be breathing. So you got that, and then he says, well, wouldn't it be great if we had your air quality data that your agency and the city government pumps out all day long? And what if we mash that up against the events? And then what if we got the weather data? And then what if we got data about vegetation? All those data sources exist, and they could all enrich the conversation and enrich our understanding about these very terrible diseases. City of Chicago is a little town up the way. Here's what they've done. They've hired a chief data officer whose just full-time job is to go find data and push it out and make it available to entrepreneurs and other innovators who can envision a way of experiencing a community differently than the city of Chicago can. So, here's an app that costs $5. I don't know how many have been sold, but the bottom line is it just pulls data directly out of a Google Fusion table right into that app and good to go. And so that's not a green field building a business up. That's building a business from halfway up. All the assets and content were in place, free of charge. You just had to figure out how to meet a market, meet a customer, do something that adds value on top of it. And then I'll wrap with my favorite example, and that's our own zoo. So when I brought my family back in July, we went to the zoo, and I have to confess, I didn't know how to get from the penguins to the monkeys, and so I whip out my phone, and I call up the maps, and like Dick Cheney's house, the Louisville Zoo is not available on Google Maps. Completely grayed out, there's nothing in there. And so, but here's the crazy thing. I work in city government. I know we have a giant database of everything that's in the zoo because that's how we made the pamphlet and that's how we made the paper map. Back to Peter, we have paper maps all day long that are based on digital data that you can get to. And so now we're working to pull that data out for everybody. There's an entrepreneur that's asking for it. We'll make it available to everybody. Maybe he makes the best app, maybe he doesn't. But my hope is that we push and we get the pull from the entrepreneur. So maybe we can be like Perth and we can have a smartphone app to get from the penguins to the monkeys. I just want you to leave with one thought, that the nature of infrastructure, public infrastructure you've paid for with your taxes has changed and is changing rapidly. And that if you have at all a community bend in you and an entrepreneurial instinct, I would encourage you to not ask, demand this be turned over to you because you paid for it. Thank you.